Starting from Southampton medieval dock, Stephen Payne headed to Canterbury on the 14th of December, following in the footsteps of an Italian teacher, Carluccio de Carrera. He set off walking northwards to the shrine of St Swithin of Winchester, then eastwards, arriving in Canterbury for the feast of Thomas Becket on the 29th of December. 188 miles in total, without using sat-nav or even a map.
They wouldn't have used maps back in the 14th century, or the maps that they had back in the 14th century wouldn't have been much use. I was basically following the Pilgrim's Way waymarkers, and along the North Downs Way, of course, you've got the chalk path that goes eastward. If I got lost, I just headed towards the rising sun. And there were a couple of times when I got lost. I actually walked for 2 or 3 hours in the wrong direction at one point. But of course, you meet people along the way, and you can always stop them and ask them, am I on the road to Canterbury? As an amateur historian, I wanted to do something that was authentic as possible, so I spent 6 months researching everything from the clothing to the kit that I carried. The clothing was largely modelled on the clothing from a chap called the Boxton Man, who was a 14th century traveller who was bopped over the head and dumped in a peat bog back in the mid-1360s. And now his entire contents of his clothing and his body are in a museum in Sweden. And I talked to the museum in Sweden, and we copied the clothing as accurately as we could. The major part of the clothing is the kirtle, which is like a long dress that falls just below the knee. Over the top of that would go a medieval cloak, which is basically my survival blanket, my tent and my bedroll all rolled into one, and on top of that would be a hood. The cloak weighs roughly 2 stone. It's made of a very heavy felted wool, which is waterproof because the lanolin's been left in it, and wool is naturally waterproof. It's enormously heavy, but during the evening it was really a lifesaver when it came to comfort, warmth, and obviously keeping the rain off.
One of Stephen's concerns was if the weather was severe, that he might need to camp down in a church porch or graveyard. He wrote to the clergy and received blessings and support from the Pope, the Bishop of Portsmouth and the Canon of Canterbury Cathedral.
The rules for the pilgrimage were basically that I wasn't allowed to stop anywhere that wasn't in existence when the original pilgrimage took place, nor was I allowed to buy food anywhere unless that was there when the original pilgrimage took place. So I was only able to buy food in a pre-14th century establishment, which didn't leave me a lot of option, and I was only allowed to sleep if the building would have been there when Carluccio went past. So in most cases I was sleeping rough in the trees and the bushes along the way.
The trip had started off being about the history of places Stephen was visiting and how his authentic clothing would fare.
Enthusiasts were interested in whether the equipment would stand up to the job, whether I would freeze to death along the way. But it turned out to be more about the people. There was a turning point in Winchester when I met a homeless man. A homeless man with only £3.50 in his pocket who had read about my trip, and he came up to me and he gave me a pasty. Now this man had only the clothes he was stood up with and £3.50, and yet he'd bought me a pasty. And from that point on, as I talked to him and as I talked to other homeless people along the way, it became more about other people who would have to sleep out at night in all sorts of weather conditions, and it became about the human side of the journey rather than the physical side.
Stephen reached Canterbury at midday on the 29th, 15 days after setting off from Southampton. His clothing stood up extraordinarily well to the rigours, but one can't help but wonder, how did he keep clean?
Along the way, I basically washed my undergarments. There's basically like a pair of shorts called brays, so I wore one and I washed one, usually in a stream or a cattle trough of some sort. And as far as I'm concerned, I washed myself with the medieval soap and the deodorant that I'd made before I set off. And again, I had to wash in streams and cattle troughs. I was actually sat in a sheep trough one day having a wash when a chap walking his dog came along, so I had to do a bit of explaining there. But it was very doable.
This is Shan Robins for That's Solent.